What's going on, guys, and welcome back. So we have one more week of set championships, well, 2 more weeks. Is it 2.5 weeks of set 4 meta game, and then we have the Bucky nerf. We have set 5 coming. I got a few things planned, and why I think Blurple is going to be a serious threat next format. Make sure you stick around, like, share, subscribe, all of that good stuff. But today we're here to talk about the best decks finishing out this format. We have our top tier, the next best, solid contenders, and rogue decks that can get the job done on the right day, the right RNG, the right local setting, the right matchups, or the right pilot. Rogue decks are decks that can see success but aren't your typical decks that you expect to do really well. So first and foremost, the first deck we have to talk about is a deck that I hyped up as a very good deck this format, and it just never really gained any traction. However, it did manage to top and get someone in Ursula, and that is Amethyst Emerald Purple Bucky. Not the Tempo build, but the Purple Bucky build. And I think the reason this deck just never took off is that when you compare it to Emerald Steel Bucky, it's just the far weaker version of Bucky decks, and most of the highly competitive players are just going to play the better version of the deck. However, I do think that Purple Bucky is a very fun deck and can get you where you need to go. The next deck is a deck that, again, I think is actually pretty fun. I had a Patreon message me on Discord, and he's like, oh, I used your Ruby Steel list and I got second place. It played really well. I really liked it, and we were talking about some changes that we would do moving forward, things like that. And just as soon as I added it into the spreadsheet, and then I went to update this past weekend, 2 other Ruby Steel decks, all 3 of them slightly differ, but relatively the same concept, some more with locations, some more aggro. A lot of fun stuff, but Ruby Steel ended up getting 3 tops in set championships this past weekend, and I think it's a rogue deck that you really shouldn't sleep on. This deck is actually pretty good in this format, and it's a strong anti-meta type choice. Again, I do have a video up on the channel, Goofy Super Squad, if you want to go check out my take on this deck. And like I said, I had a Patreon take that exact list, and he went and got second place at his set championships with it. As pinned in those comments, though, I would trade out Fortisphere for Beast Tragic Heroes if you have them. I just personally did not have them, so they were not included in on that list. The spreadsheet I'm talking about is linked down below, where we track all of the tops for the format, and we talk about all the decks topping set championships. For the format, I believe we're at almost 600. I think there's like 564 tops recorded, so go feel free to check that out. The next deck is Blue Steel, whether that is with your Whole New World or without your Whole New World. We got a special guest. If you didn't check out our last video, the Hyper Aggro list, my son did his very first video almost by himself, helped him out a little bit. Commenting is turned off because it's catered towards kids, because the title has for kids in it, so YouTube categorized it that way. But
Dad, we found more mints.
Okay, cool. Have fun with your movie.
I don't know if there's any more.
Okay, well, how about you go see how many you can find?
Bye.
Bye. So, oh, thank you. So, Blue Steel with or without the wheel. Of course, this must be a top tier deck, right? It's actually going to go into our next best category. And that's because the decks in the top tier category, when we see how much they're topping and how well they're doing, they're just clear cut the best decks. The next best, these 3 decks that, hint, hint, spoiler alert, the 3 decks in our next best category are all within just like 2 tops of each other, whereas the top decks are almost doubled this next tier. So it might kind of be a spoiler already, but I think these decks are noticeably better than the solid contenders, but they're not quite there at the top tier. Blue Steel is an amazing answer to Bucky decks, so that's why it's seeing so much success this format. Ruby Amethyst has a decent Bucky matchup and just strong matchups across the board. The deck is so consistent, it is definitely going to be in our top tier category. It has continued to climb in its overall percentage of the pie chart every single week. Mickey's Brooms, or should we say Yen Sid and his Brooms. And this isn't just the 1 and 2 drop Brooms with Yen Sid in an Amethyst Steel deck. This is a more focused Broom deck, and it's got a few tops this set championship format, so that's pretty cool. It's nice to see the deck going. Realistically, they're like one more good Broom away from being a solid contender, but for now they are going to be in our Rogue category. Lemon Lime Hyper Aggro. Like I said, my 7-year-old did his breakdown of this deck, and well, Lemon Lime Hyper Aggro did get atop this format in set championships, so they do get to make it into our video here. It wasn't my son, but I think that Hyper Aggro decks are a fantastic strategy for younger kids to learn. Just to get their toes wet, get them in the game, and then work on strategy and more thought out, more sequencing type decks afterwards. But Hyper Aggro decks, I think, are fantastic for getting young players or just new to TCG players into the game, and they can see success with these style decks. Steel Song. This deck has been coming on so strong lately. Where does it end up? It actually is one top behind Blue Steel. It's right there with it. It's been a very strong deck into the format. And for set championships, if you remember our prediction video, I put this as my 4th best deck of the set championships, and it's done absolutely that. The only thing I did get wrong was I didn't have Blue Steel as the 3rd best deck. I had it as the 5th best deck, so we were slightly off, but our top 5 was almost spot on. Actually, we could go as far as to say our top 10 was almost spot on. Talking about our top 10, Tempo was our number 6 on that list, and well, it's pretty much number 6, 7, A and B, 6A, 6B, whatever you want to call it. However, the gap between Tempo, this format, and like Steel Song deck or Blue Steel, it's a noticeable gap. Tempo has been doing much better than these decks that we'll see down here in Rogue. However, it's also still noticeably behind our next best category, so that's why we split this up. If we put like tier numbers on it, it would be tier 1, and then people hate it, that's why we use these wording, but you'd almost have to call this tier 1.5, because percentage-wise, they're right there. They're like very, very borderline top tier. But technically they're not. Most people say anything over 10% is a top tier deck, whereas the 3 in our next best category are like 9.3, 9.4, 9.45. So it's like they're so close to hitting that 10% mark, but they're much higher than the 2-3% mark that some of our other solid contenders in the tier 2 category would be. So Hero Aggro, this Amber Sapphire build came out of nowhere, and I'm also working on a list or a video for, we're going to have our top 5 spiciest decks to win an Ursula, where I'm going to pick my top 5, showcase them, and we're going to go over the deck list. I'm going to have you guys vote on what was the spiciest deck to win an Ursula this set championship, just as a fun little video to show off some of the creativeness, because the game isn't just 2 decks. The game isn't just 3 decks. There's a lot of decks that can see success. You already know, top tier, Bucky discard. I have nothing to say about this deck. I don't need to get into it. We all know why it's top tier. We all know that it is top tier. If only this deck could get it done on the biggest of stages. They won DLC Chicago, but other than that, they've actually failed to make the finals in the last few big tournaments, being Botcham, Fort Worth, the 10K. This deck has not even made the finals in those 3 events. However, it is still showing out. It is still overwhelming the top cuts, and it's just dominating local scenes. This deck is crazy. It's going away, but Emerald Steel is here to stay. It's still going to be a very strong deck moving forward. It's just not going to be Bucky discard anymore. We briefly mentioned it as our 6A, 6B deck. Amethyst Steel is going to be right there with Tempo in our solid contenders deck. This combination has the consistency and draw of Amethyst, the board control presence of Steel, and both those decks actually can get kind of aggressive in the early game without being a full-on committed aggro deck, where you can have Maleficent on 1, Smee on 2, and really put pressure on your opponent. But then as the game develops, you have your Queen's Castles, your Merlin Goats, your Along Came Zeuses to just stabilize and control the board state and win in that mid game if you need to. This was the deck that I chose to play last weekend. I was going to do a video on the deck, and I had every intention on playing Ruby Steel at set championships or Ruby Amethyst, one of the two. And I was like, oh, I wonder how Emerald Sapphire would do. And I was just like, let's go ahead, let's put a list together. And I did it. And I'm like, oh, this actually feels pretty good. And I'm sitting there testing it, and then testing it against my Bucky deck, against my Ruby Amethyst deck, against my Tempo decks. And I'm like, holy cow, this is actually doing really good. Like, I want to take this deck to set championships now. So we did. We got our Ursula. That video is up on the channel breaking down the deck, why things like Cogsworth and Aurora, just being able to ramp with the blue engine. You have Bucky going, Cogsworth and Aurora to kind of counter the Steel and Ruby metas, respectively. The deck was a lot of fun, and it takes a lot of thinking because you don't just play it linear. Every matchup is different, and that's one thing I really liked about the deck because it pushed me as a player to know my matchups really well. Another deck that's going to be represented in our top 5 spiciest decks, Towel Man Purple put it on the map, and then guys like David at my locals took down Ursula's with it, and he wasn't the only one. Amber Ruby Locations. Just in time to Jim Hawkins, to RLS Legacy, to move there for free on turn 3. It's aggressive, it's hard to deal with, it's a lot of willpower, and it closes games out quickly. That's not the only play line in this deck, and it is a very strong, very fun deck, and it's won multiple Ursula. So once again, it's going to go down in our rogue category, and if you haven't already, feel free to go on over to Inkdex and check out those lists. Again, otherwise I will have a video coming up with it in it as well. Moving forward, Emerald Ruby Aggro. This deck started to see, like, the first weekend of set championship, it actually did pretty good, had multiple tops, and then it kind of teetered off and faded away a little more. I think it's just not a very popular deck. However, the evasive aggro aspect of this deck makes it very fast and hard to deal with for certain decks. While having all those evasives, it actually deals with the Bucky deck decently well if you can get the board presence out there first. And then you have your evasives, you deal with the Diablos, you deal with the Pegasuses, which didn't really see much more play as the format shifted. They did get cut from most of those Bucky lists, but it depended too on how those Steel songs hit, because they have all their songs, so they can deal with your board that way. But the deck proved that, especially when Sisu was popular early on, this deck was very, very strong. And maybe Sisu kind of falling off is part of why this deck also started to fall off, because Bucky, Ruby Amethyst, Blue Steel, and Steel Song all answer aggro much better than Sisu can. Wheel Fasa, Steel Fasa, the real Fasa. That was actually pretty good. Just thought of that. Anyway, this deck is sneaky good. It's pretty strong. It's consistent. It topped the DLC Fort Worth. It was a top 64. It's gotten Ursula's. It has been performing this format a little bit earlier in the format. Again, it's another deck we did a video on, and I actually really liked it. I played 2 whole new worlds, I want to say, and I forget exactly what else. But it was another one of those videos where it's like, why aren't you playing Tragic Hero? Because we tragically don't have the hero. But we'll get our Beast Tragic Heroes because the card's just too darn good. Not to in that way I can give you guys real life deck profiles that are truly optimal, because we play with what we got. So we need to get better, right? Get good, as the kids say. They still say that, right? Anyway, while we're on this topic of Mufasa decks, we have Ruby Fasa. This deck, it's going to go up in our solid contenders. It has multiple wins at set championships. It's topped multiple DLCs, and it just gets better and better because each format, Ruby seems to get another strong big boss option that you can play with this. This format was Sisu, obviously set 1 when Mufasa wasn't legal, or I shouldn't say legal, when Mufasa wasn't a thing. Or was he set 1, or was he was set 2, right? Set 2, set 1. Set 2. I want to say, yeah, Mufasa was set 2. Right? Yeah. But anyway, you had Maleficent, then we get Lady Tremaines, then you have things like Medusas in 3, Sisu's in 4. And Ruby's just always going to be that archetype that gets those big late game threats. Whether they're inkable or not, though, is going to kind of limit which ones you can or cannot play. Another deck that is just so fun to play, to pilot, and we saw it on stream multiple times. Zach Bivens, just what he was doing with this deck. I believe someone actually got into, was it top 32? Zach finished in top 64 at Fort Worth. So there was 2 of the players playing this deck, and they were both piloting it really well. But in feature, we saw Zach doing things like using his muses when he plays the song to bounce his own aerial so that he could replay it and just look for more songs repeatedly. And it's just such a smart strategy to be able to keep recycling your card, to keep playing your card, to get that advantage. So it's going to be one of those cards that, again, it's doing well at DLC events. It's doing really well at set championship events. So it's going into our solid contenders spot. Amber, Amethyst, Hyper, Aggro. This deck has taken down, I want to say it was three set championships now. Maybe it's only 2 and 3 total tops. But I've said this the whole time. An aggro deck in the right environment, the right timing, can just walk right through people. The set championship I just had when I played the Emerald Sapphire Bucky list, first place, she was playing a Amber Amethyst Hyper aggro deck, and like the Ruby Amethyst players are just like, we just couldn't keep up. We're on the 4-1 drops, and she just got out so quick you could not answer it. And I actually had to go against not her but a different Hyper aggro, which is actually my son, and a tempo deck, which is much quicker. And with the Sapphire decks, those fast-paced decks just are hard to deal with, and that's why in the right environment, like an aggro deck, Bucky can kind of be a toss-up. But if your local is more Ruby and more Sapphire built decks and less Bucky, less Steel Song, play a Hyper aggro deck. Bucky, Steel Song, those are the matchups that kind of turn the aggro away, but even blue steel can struggle into those, especially if you hit the grab their swords out of their hand. And well, let's face it, you're probably playing Amber or Emerald in your Hyper aggro deck, which means Ursula or Bare Necessities are options to be able to hit those grab your swords. Lastly, we have the Ruby Sapphire decks with or without Sisu, Popsicle control, Sisu on ice, red, blue, whatever you want to call it. This deck is right there in our next best category. It has been falling off as the format goes, but it's still doing enough to stick around right in that 9% range, right with blue steel and steel songs. So this is my overall breakdown tier list of where the format is at right now. Let me know what you guys think, and until next time, like, share, subscribe, comment down below. This is just based off of how these decks are performing, not necessarily what their true power levels are. And part of this, do remember, is going to be, how well represented is a deck. Because if you go into a major event and only 5 people are playing a deck out of 2,000, there's not a good chance that 4 people top with the deck. So do keep in mind, representation does play a role, but at the end of the day, usually if a deck's really good, more people play it. So do keep that in mind too. But all of these decks, obviously your top tier is your best chance to win. Your next best is, well, you guessed it, the next best. Your solid contenders also are decks that absolutely set championships. Easily these decks can win. DLCs, these decks can perform. They can get you on a run into the top cut. Absolutely. All 4 of these decks have proven that. 3 of them just topped the most recent DLC. Tempo was the only odd man out, but it had multiple tops in Botcham and second place in Chicago. And then the rogue decks also are decks that pop up in DLCs, but are all over the place in set championships. So any of these decks can get you that set championship. And I don't want to say you're limited to these decks, because you're not. Before some of these decks, Emerald Sapphire, Amber, before Amethyst Bucky, before Steel Mufasa, like a lot of these decks, before that one person topped with it, it was at 0. Your deck could be that 0 that is just waiting for that one person to top with it. So go have fun, do your best, and may the odds ever be in your favor. Wait, that's not Disney, right? I guess the journey awaits, guys. Thanks for watching. Until next time, like we said, like, share, subscribe, comment down below. Take care.